One of the most alarming trends we're seeing in teenagers today is the prevalence of anxiety. If one of your children or a teenager you know is struggling with anxiety, we are thrilled to share a resource to help. Rooted's 2023 book release with PNR Publishing, Anxiety, Finding a Better Story. It's a 31-day devotional for teenagers written by mental health counselor and friend of Rooted, Liz Edrington. As a teenager, Liz felt overwhelmed by anxiety. Now that she's a mental health counselor, she wants to pass on what she's learned. Just understanding what anxiety is makes a big difference. But what makes an even bigger difference is understanding what God has to say about it. With daily scripture readings, breathing exercises, and additional mental health resources, this little book offers comfort and help for teenagers in the midst of their anxiety. We invite them to see how their anxiety fits into God's big story and to learn how Jesus can bring peace.
You are listening to the Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable, part of the Rooted family of podcasts, advancing gospel-centered youth ministry for those serving in Asian American contexts and their students, equipping those serving to more effectively disciple students, and empowering families and churches to minister to Asian American youth more faithfully.
Hello, and welcome to the Rooted Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable. I am your host, Terrence Shay. I serve as the family pastor at FCBC Walnut here in Southern California. Joining me today are two youth pastor pros, Huey and Dorothy, with years of experience under their belts for us to learn and grow from. So before you two introduce yourselves, I got to ask you, how many of us think that our podcast needs a shorter name? Because I think I switch up the words every single time I try to say it. But it's okay, because we want to be as accurate as possible. This is who we are, but man, this is a long one. It's a long title for us. All right, well, let's go ahead and start with Huey. Tell us a little bit more about you, where you're serving, and how long you've been in youth ministry.
Hello everyone. Terrence, thanks for hosting. My name is Huey, and I've been in youth ministry off and on for, I would say, a little bit, maybe 17, 18 years now. And I currently serve at Christ Central Presbyterian Church, which in Centerville, Virginia, which is about 25 minutes west of Washington, D.C. So that's where I am.
All right, thank you. And I see that you're rooting for the Yankees. All right, Dorothy, how about you?
Hi, I'm Dorothy, and I am the youth director at the Chinese Bible Church of Maryland in Rockville, Maryland, about 25 minutes north of Washington, D.C. metro, or about 18 to 20 miles. And I have been in youth ministry for about 15 years, ever since high school, and full-time, though, for the last 6 years, but bivocationally 5 years before that, yeah. So it's been some time. And glad to be here. Thanks again, Terrence, for having us.
Wow, it looks like I'm just talking to the DMV this time. All right, that's great.
Basically.
And I got to be rooting for my Dodgers during this time. So hopefully by the time this episode airs, we'll get some good news on my side in the West Coast. All right, well, our topic for this month is the key players for vibrant youth ministry, which is what we're all after. Without this essential group of people serving together with us, youth pastors and leaders are not going to be able to fulfill our calling to make disciples of the next generation. So the people we're going to talk about and spend time on in reflection and also in brainstorming is our beloved team members and volunteers, those that then we get the privilege to lead and to serve with. So begin with, I wanted to just ask you guys a very simple question. When we're thinking about this category of volunteers or team members, who are they? How do they work alongside with you in your ministries? And how do you set them up in terms of their roles and what they do?
My volunteers, they, by God's grace, they have been a multi-generational spread. The youngest volunteers, we call them helpers because they're college students, and our more seasoned volunteers are working professionals. One is a retired public school teacher. A handful of them are in the 30s range, I would say, 30s, early to mid 40s. And so some of them are parents as well. Mm-hmm. So it's been a blessing to serve and be together in this dynamic, because I think I've learned a lot just in the diversity that exists with our team. We have 10 overall who are volunteers, and then a very committed overseeing church elder who is extremely instrumental in making sure that we have what we need, resourceful, very caring. And so, our volunteers are mostly within this Maryland region. I don't think there's any in Virginia, but some of them have even grown up within my church as well. So they have the longevity, they have the insider knowledge, but also they've seen the youth group evolve in the last 20 plus years.
For me, I love this topic, Terrence. I think this is such an important topic, and like you said from the very beginning, we can't do ministry without our volunteers, right? So I appreciate them very much. And in this season, I get to serve with about 22 volunteers, and they're kind of more on a very high commitment level in terms of youth ministry, and they're predominantly young adults. I would say anywhere in their early to mid to late 20s. That's kind of our demographic. We have a couple of parents who have kids in the youth ministry that are also serving, but predominantly young adults in their 20s that are serving. And within those 22 volunteers, there's kind of like two groups. I have a smaller group within that larger group where I call them kind of my core team, and I meet with them weekly, and they're kind of the brains and the engine of our youth ministry. So they're kind of like my core staff that I meet with weekly to not only talk about the week-to-week stuff, but they're the ones that are helping me strategize for the long-term things, the big picture stuff. They're helping me implement some of the policies or some of the ways that we want to do ministry. They're the ones that are kind of helping me do that. And then the others are mainly our small group leaders. So what we try to do is our small groups on a weekly that meet on a weekly basis. They're divided in their age, grade specific and gender specific. So I think we have about 14 small groups that are happening on a weekly basis, and we try to have at least 2 leaders per small group. So that's why I try to have a bigger team, and their main focus really is to meet with the students, to have sermon discussions, or to do a Bible study with them, and then occasionally do some small group outings, just kind of that they schedule on their own. So those are kind of my main volunteers. And then in addition to that, I have what I call a parent support team. And they kind of really serve as a liaison to the rest of the parents. So if there are needs, concerns, or if we just need help with certain Sundays when we have youth group oriented meals or gatherings, they're kind of the group that brings other parents together to help with different aspects of our youth ministry. So I would say those are kind of my core volunteer base.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing from both of you. The ways in which you think about your volunteers, how they serve, who they are, really sounds like you're not only serving with them, but that you're walking with them and that you know them and that you're shepherding them and equipping them as well. So let me ask you guys this follow-up question. You mentioned a variety of types of volunteers, different commitments, and so on and so forth. I mean, typically, what type of expectations do you have for your volunteers? Who would make a good volunteer?
I can go first here. I think for me, one of the things that I try to emphasize a lot with our volunteers is they're not volunteers first and then church members or attenders or worshipers second. I want to really emphasize that that's flipped around. So, they are valuable members of our church first. They are worshipers first, and then secondly, their primary role, the way that they expand the kingdom and help our church grow and flourish, is as youth ministry volunteers, right? So, I really want to encourage them to engage in the life of the church first as members. So that means as best as they can, they're attending service, right? They are part of community groups for themselves, and that youth ministry and their students particularly are not their, it's not their community, right? That is not their community, right? It's a place there where they exercise their gifts to serve. So that's one thing. I think about what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, where he says, follow me as I follow Christ, or imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's kind of the model that I would love for our volunteers to demonstrate to our students, right? Is they are walking and they are following with Jesus, as they're inviting their students to do that, right? So I definitely want to emphasize that. I expect them fully to have a life outside of youth ministry.
Mhm.
I think one of the dangers I think can be is that our volunteers like make youth ministry like their entire life,
Mhm.
and I think that in some ways that's honorable, right? But I think that can also be dangerous. So I really want them to have a life outside of youth ministry. I don't want their times majority of the time to be spent with students. I want them to be flourishing in other areas of their lives. So that's another expectation that I have for them. And then thirdly, I think I mean, I've heard this said before to me when I was when I was kind of growing up, and I think this is still true. I think 80-90% of youth ministry is just being present,
Right.
right? So as much as possible to show up and to be there when their students are there as much as they can, while just balancing their life and work and their own family, whatever that looks like. I think just being present with our students and our ministry, I really think in a lot of ways that's the bulk of what youth ministry is. It's just being there with them, not just being there to say something to them or teach them something, but just to be there in presence, right? So I think that's the top three things I talk about the most when I talk about volunteers.
Is that on paper? Is that in writing?
It is actually, yeah. When I do kind
Okay.
of like volunteer orientation, those are
Hmm.
some of the things that I go through. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
Nice.
good. I like that.
I mean, not the same as, but in a similar vein to Huey, my volunteers, they have a very multifaceted skill set. Um, and at the same time, their responsibilities range. Not everyone will do everything, and I say that not comically at all. Where if everyone did everything, there's no need for specialization. So I think there needs to be, of course, a very basic or baseline level of capability, because as much as someone may have desire to serve, they might not be a good fit within the ministry.
Mm.
So my current volunteers, they've been in it for a long haul, and they have the rapport, they have the trust of students, but of course, the expectation for them to always be relevant, like not necessarily, because the benefit of not being particularly like close in age means that you have a little bit more life to live and to offer to these students who have not lived as much life. So kind of going back to the first question, right, what do my volunteers do on a given basis for each Friday, which is our typical gatherings? They may help with co-leading worship with some of our students for worship team. They
Mhm.
might be helping out with AV or training kids to operate AV. Some of them may be running our check-in. We do a Google Sheet and do check-in for each student that comes in and write down name tags, right? Um, some of the volunteers may be delivering a talk or a message on a given Friday on a specific topic, or giving their testimonies, teaching Sunday school, walking with students, counseling them in specific scenarios, leading group discussions. But I think that's the main bulk of it in terms of our Fridays and Sundays. I want to be intentional as to not give them more than what is reasonable for a ministry, because I think that for a long time, ethnic churches have just relied on the youth ministry to disciple their kids for them. And
Mhm.
respectfully, with the age or with the language difference, or just trying to be relevant or to communicate spiritual things in your second language is difficult, right? The benefit, I think, of having the volunteers that I do have is these are sometimes parents interacting with students, where parents can be friends, but it's a different perspective. And then um, I don't expect my volunteers to take a student's side. I never advise them like for that, right? It's like, don't just try to side with one party or the other. Is try to understand all sides. How do
Mhm.
we approach this biblically?
Mhm.
But in the more concrete fashion, anytime that we may have a volunteer come on board, we go through periodic trainings, which we'll talk about in the next episode too. But it is in writing that like these are when we have our official gatherings with fellowship, of meeting together, of committing to praying for one another. And sometimes it's mostly like administrative things. We have a group chat, and responsiveness is definitely appreciated with those. But overall, I think we're in this current phase, I think trying to find a little bit of a new flow for our ministry, because what we've been doing in the past, say 5 to 10 years, the kids are very different now than they were before, right?
Hmm.
I'm not going to say that COVID is to blame for all these things, but also we're just finding that our capacities have changed and we're not as able to take on as much as we did before. So I think that that should be reflected in the ministry capacities that we engage ourselves to. Um, at some point, a parent called me and asked, why can't we organize more fellowships and hangouts for the students? And I said, you're welcome to take prerogative and initiative with that amongst the other families, but I cannot expect the youth ministers or the youth volunteers to do that because they have families, they have lives, they need rest. And so I told that point blank to my volunteers, like, you don't have to organize any of this outside of the outline commitments on our Fridays and on our Sundays. Maybe once every quarter we'll have like a Saturday thing, but that's very seldom. Because just like Huey said, we don't want to make youth ministry our entire lives because it means that they're so focused in this one specific area of ministry. Like, what about their families? What about their own personal spiritual lives? And if they can't tend to themselves spiritually, then it'll just spill over into this scarcity within youth ministry.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you guys are highlighting not just what is happening now, but then the changes that we've seen take place. That youth ministry has changed in the last decade or two. Our culture, history has changed things a lot for us. And so how then we expect and prepare our volunteers to serve should change as well, and has changed. Whether we are reacting, sometimes, unfortunately, we're just trying to catch up. Other times we could be proactive and actually taking the bend and leading them that direction. So I want to ask you guys then, how has it tangibly shifted in ways that are describable or noticeable from your experience in terms of working with volunteers and what they are expected to go through?
Hmm. I just think, yeah, like Dorothy said, I don't want to say COVID, is to blame for a lot of these things, but I think it's true too. Like, I think youth ministry has changed a lot, and I do think youth ministry has become a lot harder.
Mm.
Just even in terms of relationships, I think
Mm-hmm.
when I look at our volunteers and our students, I think one of the areas where they struggle most is um, feeling wanted and needed by their students.
Yeah.
Either they are so either glued to their phones, or they have social anxiety, or they're just not relationally open. The leaders feel very ill-equipped and inadequate to kind of enter into their lives, and I think that's a challenge that I see, at least in my ministry, and also just for our leaders, I think, and I don't know if this is just kind of my church, or this is indicative of other churches in the area, but my leaders feel ill-equipped in some ways because they themselves were never they feel like they were never discipled when they were growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to give something away to their students that they genuinely want to, but they feel like they've never really received growing up,
Mm-hmm.
there's such a disconnect and a challenge, and they do feel inadequate and ill-equipped to do that. So I think that's one area of challenge that I see, and I think that also can lead to just a burnout too. When you enter into youth ministry and you're excited and you're eager, and it doesn't pan out the way that they thought or they expected, there's discouragement there, and they can kind of easily feel like, oh, like this is not what I thought it was going to be. I think they have a good desire of making an impact, but I think sometimes it just takes a lot longer than you want or you hope, right? So
Mhm.
I think burnout is real.
I think Huey brings up really good points about how today's youth volunteers often feel unprepared and ill equipped to handle today's teens. Because the reality is, these teens have grown up in entirely different conditions than, say, when any of us were in youth ministry. And for those who are listening too, right? They may be, in their 20s, or they have been in youth ministry for decades, or maybe, you're just kind of listening to see what we have to offer, which um, by no means am I a professional, even though Terrence said that in the beginning. I think it's just I've seen a number of things over the years, but the context that I grew up in was Chinatown, Chicago, and then coming here to the DC metropolitan is just like it's like suburban but busier, right? But
Hmm.
it's not as busy as the urban. And yet, one of the biggest shifts that I've really seen is how kids now are even busier than before.
Mm.
And not only ministering amidst, social inadeptness and anxiety, or this over reliance in technology, or relationally being closed off. On top of that, it's how there's just this apathy, I think.
Mm.
The apathy that exists among students, some students, not saying all, I don't want to make a blanket statement, that it's like, meet me where I'm at, but I don't really want to meet you. Right. So in the last few years, especially since COVID, though, I will admit, I've just questioned, like, do I want to keep ministering in this environment? That's not to say I want to quit youth ministry, but that because of these seemingly insurmountable challenges or shifts, I realize for myself that this chasm, or the divide, or the space between me and the students, like the youngest of Gen Z slash now Gen Alpha, I just don't know how to interact with them.
Yeah.
And when I try, all they do is like half the time shrug their shoulders and walk away and don't engage in any conversation. So, but I feel for my volunteers too, because they're really trying. They are really trying. And I think these kids right now, is just, it takes more time to try to approach them. And the kids just don't really know how to reciprocate. But on top of that, and this is one other thing that might not be completely relevant, but for better or for worse, parents are a lot more involved now than they've ever been, I think, in youth
Mm.
ministry.
Mm.
And with that comes the expectations that they may hold, or that they want you to over communicate. What's going on with youth group? What are we doing? When are we starting? Are we starting at a different time? What do you want me to do? And then even if you communicate, I think there's so many communications that they may receive from other channels. It's like, tell me what to do. I'm like, I did. It was in the weekly email.
Yeah.
So
Come on,
I don't want to
everyone reads every
discredit.
email we send. What are you talking about,
I don't
Dorothy?
want. I
Right?
don't
Everyone
know, but
does,
this.
right?
So it's just like, I think sometimes I feel a little bit of consternation, even though, like, I'm just reminded that I'm human. I'm reminded I'm very human in youth ministry, and to kind of resonate with or empathize with Danny is, parents can be a tremendous help, but sometimes they can be the cause of concern. And so, as much as I want to see holistic youth ministry unfold, um, we're just constantly in a changing dynamic environment that it is so hard to keep up, and to find time to slow down when everything seems to continuously accelerate.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, and just to add to that too, I think um, my role maybe as a youth pastor maybe like 10 years ago, um, I feel like I had more bandwidth, and
Hmm.
I really felt like my calling was to really engage with the students, right? So I was like, I was a youth pastor that built relationships with my students, but I think now I really do feel like my time is split between pastoring our volunteers,
Right.
shepherding and caring for volunteers as much, or if not a little bit more, that I'm
Hmm.
like face to face and like leading our students, you
Right.
know? And I don't know if that's because I am a little bit older now. I'm in my 40s, and
You
you
are
know,
not.
work, I am in my 40s. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like, I do see that my volunteers who are in their 20s, they are far more, they can far more easily adapt, and they're far more accessible to our students because they're just closer in age,
Hmm.
right? So I don't know if that, I'm sure that that plays some role there, but I do feel like my role has shifted a little bit, where I'm more attentive, and I'm pastorally shepherding and caring for our volunteers as much, or if not more, that I'm actually doing with my students.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a role that I've kind of shifted into over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I think. And I think it's needed, just
Yeah.
because of where our volunteers are.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, bringing it back to something that you guys brought up, which you said is not like the main cause or a source of blame, but I do think that for this generation of students, the pandemic is life-changing, earth-shattering every way, in a way of, kind of confining them in a couple of years to a whole separate environment. It kind of takes away a lot of normal personal interactions. How do you make eye contact? How do you have a conversation? People can't stare at a paragraph in a book and hold their attention because they're like, well, I'd rather be entertained by this or that, or I'm Zoom classroom, no one's really listening to the teacher. It becomes normal. So all of these things kind of become compounded on maybe what are simple expectations that our volunteers have when they work with the students, of being able to talk to them or teach them something or to share openly, and having that not being reciprocated. Over time, we do need to shepherd and guide these volunteers because they might take it personally. They might, really be
Yeah.
frustrated. They might be disappointed or hard on themselves, and that's not always the case. What would you guys like to say as an encouragement or just like a word of appreciation to your volunteers?
Yeah, what I want to say, and I've said it to my volunteers as often as I can, is that their stories matter, their journey with God, their experiences, both the mountaintops and the valleys, all of those things that God has written over their lives, they matter, and they were meant to be shared with, not just with their peers, but with the next generation. Right? I really do feel and believe that the next generations will be formed by the way that we have learned to follow Jesus along the way. Both through the joys and the sorrows, right? So it may not always feel like their presence and their stories matter on a week to week, month to month basis. But I mean, even for me, like when I think about my just growing up in my youth ministry, it wasn't until 10, 15 years later where I thought about just kind of my upbringing and how grateful I am for the people that God has placed in my life years ago and that have shaped me and formed me. So I think that's just how it works, right? You don't know that the people that are right in front of you that are showing up on a week to week basis, like a lot of times you don't know that they matter until like years later, right? So I want to encourage my volunteers, all of our volunteers, right? Um, I think our calling is to be faithful even when things seem a little fruitless,
Mm.
Mm.
and because it'll yield its fruit in due time. So just thank you for serving. Thank you for being there, being present through the challenges and everything else that comes with that. And let's just be faithful until God calls us elsewhere. And I think our really God will not waste a day that we will serve His kingdom. Right. So, yeah, stay faithful. Hmm.
All right, a little bit of a tangent before Dorothy goes. Now, Huey, were you like the perfect youth, like that godly Christian youth when you were young growing up in church?
Actually, you know what? I saw my old Bible study, my high school Bible study teacher,
Yeah,
right? Like not too long ago. So it's been like 20 years since I saw her.
yeah.
I asked her like, what was I like as a youth student? And I really expected her to say, "Man, you showed up every week and you were like my go-to student." She
Yeah.
said, I was so emotional all the time. I was just like, I was so moody all the time, you know? And praise God that she still came and showed up and taught me the book of Ephesians.
Yeah, I feel like, your story is descriptive of many. I mean, when we were kids, we were kids.
Yeah,
But
we were
people
kids.
invested in
Yeah.
us, and who knows? Maybe the kid that you guys are spending time building a relationship and teaching the gospel to might become someone that God uses to be a pastor someday. And
No,
not that that's like mountaintop, but you just don't know. And we
that's
appreciate
right.
you so much. Thanks for sharing, Huey.
What I would want to tell my volunteers, which similar to Huey, right? Try to tell them as often as I can is number one, and to those who are listening, you're doing a good job.
Hmm.
Not just that it's a job, but like the efforts that are exerted, the thoughtfulness that goes into meeting with students or listening to students or trying to understand new or different ways to more effectively reach them. Like, well done. You're really plowing through even when the conditions aren't the greatest. And sometimes the hardest part about agriculture is just getting the soil ready. And I think a lot of youth ministry and children's ministry, for that matter, is preparing the soil.
Hmm.
And that is such an arduous task, but it's one that, unless it's done, you can't really plant seeds to grow anything. So you're doing a good job, brothers and sisters, as you serve, as you labor, as you plan the things that are seen and unseen.
Mm,
And then the second thing that I would say to my volunteers and other youth volunteers alike is that um, there is nothing that God won't use in your life.
yeah.
Or put positively, there is a meaningful and purposeful, eventual, timely usefulness to what you're going through. And I was talking to a college helper earlier today and saying how he, this is a slight tangent, he had been approached by some middle school girls who were, pestering him about relationship issues. And I was
Mhm.
like, yeah, that's not an appropriate conversation to have with people who are half your age. But on the other hand, he was just saying that, like, yeah, I don't need this. And I was trying to, pass them off to someone, a female counselor to talk to, but he was like looking for help and the help didn't come. Uh, but just like in his own past, not that he had a ton of relationship issues, but just knowing like these girls were talking to him about how they are having boy problems, or the guys that they're quote unquote dating, as if you really date in the 7th and 8th grade, are not treating them well. And he's like, then they're not good guys. Right. So I think just in general, to circle back, is like the experiences that we go through and the things that we learn from them, God can use those things. And
Mm,
so to similarly mirror Huey, right? Like, as we are continuing to be faithful to our calling or to this season, the Lord will teach us and show us many things. And maybe in a way, we go through a period of deep sorrow or mourning or brokenness or grief, and how we wrestle with that, how we deal with that, positive and joyful emotions. The students will see how we care for ourselves
yeah.
and care for others. And so the third thing I would say is volunteer, please care for yourself, so that ministry is not just out of your scarcity, but it's out of Christ's abundance in
Mm,
your life, right?
yeah.
So for sure, you're doing a good job. Um, and then secondly, there's nothing that God won't use that you've gone through. And third is to take care of yourself, so that whatever you do in ministry, it's because of Christ, not because of your own strength.
Dorothy, though, are those three things written down anywhere?
They are etched in my brain, but I could text them later to my volunteers just to reiterate again. Yes, yes,
Awesome. Well, from my end, working with parents a lot more exclusively and
for
personally,
sure. Yeah.
just speaking on their behalf, man, like a lot of times, parents are just lost in so many ways. They feel
Yeah.
insecure. They don't know how to talk to their kids. And sometimes they probably, in an unfair way, put a lot of pressure and burden and expectations on you guys as volunteers. But know this, it's because for the most part, your goodwill parent that loves their kids wants to see them know and love the Lord as well. So they look to you and they see hope in you. and they see the possibility of their kids coming to know the gospel for themselves, to love Jesus, and to be a part of the church through your ministry. And so you're just greatly appreciated for everything that you do and the time that you spent, because disciple making calls for relationships, and you guys are in the trenches. And so just want to appreciate you for all that you do with our students, and the ways in which you bear and put up with the parents as well. Sometimes parents could be difficult, but we love the same God, and we want to continue to walk and journey with you.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for listening today to the Rooted Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable, acronym to be announced. We look forward to the next time we chat. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you as we trust in the death and resurrection of Christ to transform the people in our homes and churches. Be sure to follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find us on Instagram at The Rooted Ministry. Talk with you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable, part of the Rooted family of podcasts. You can go even deeper into gospel-centered, Bible-saturated youth ministry by listening to our other podcasts, including the Rooted Youth Ministry Podcast and the Rooted Parent Podcast. Find them all at rootedministry.com.
Do you remember what it felt like to be a little kid at Christmas time? There's nothing quite like the anticipation of Christmas morning. But the holiday can lose its wonder as we wake up to the many hard things going on in our lives and in the world. The loss we feel over our childhood experience points to a deeper longing inside all of us, for everything sad to be undone and for us to live together with God in perfect joy. This fall, Rooted is releasing a new Advent devotional for teenagers with New Growth Press called Longing for Christmas. We look at 25 promises God made and fulfilled in the coming of Jesus. As we explore the way God has kept his promises, teenagers will be encouraged that all of the longing they feel for a better world and for things to be made right will be fully met in Jesus Christ.